Hi, so my name is Sunia, and I'm going to be starting off our presentation by talking about the commodity of oil. These are just a few statistics on oil. So, oil is an incredibly important resource globally. In 2024, over 37 billion barrels of oil were consumed, which means 5 barrels per person. The countries that we talk about in this presentation that also have some of the largest oil reserves are Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And oil is it's useless by itself, so we have to refine it to make it useful. But one of the biggest things it's refined for is for transportation fuel. And so there's very much a connection between the prices of oil and the price of gasoline, the high prices that we're seeing in the US today. And we analyzed news articles during the semester for the project, and oil prices seem to be the most affected by supply shocks caused by changes in regulations or the actions of governments. So we didn't see as many demand shocks, although we will definitely be talking about some. So for our first graph, so Saudi Arabia is a member country of OPEC, which is a organization of oil-rich countries that basically collaborate to influence how much oil is being produced and the price of oil. And so in this graph is showing point in time around a week or so before the war between the US and Iran. And essentially, because Saudi Arabia is expecting that or is fearing that there is going to be war between the US and Iran, and because Iran is such an oil-rich country, and because the Strait of Hormuz that is near it is a very control transports like 20% of the world's supply of oil. Saudi Arabia decided to increase its production. And this is interesting because usually, if you're sort of thinking about it in terms of like a firm and a market, like the market for like iPads or something, if a firm is expecting that there is going to be an increase in the price of its commodity that it's producing, then you would expect the firm to actually decrease its supply of that commodity in the present, waiting for that future increase in prices so that it can make a profit. But here we can see that Saudi Arabia actually increases its supply in an attempt to keep the prices low and to keep making sure that there's not a shortage of oil. And that really tells us how important oil is globally, like for global stability, like how important it is. And so, because of Saudi Arabia's actions, where it shifts from S1 to S2, so we have this new intersection of the supply curve, the new supply curve, and the demand curve, where the price is lower. And then our next graph is essentially looking at how a price of oil could remain stable. So this was a news article about it remaining stable despite the fact that there is an increase in oil stores. So oil stores are basically how much oil a country has, and there was an unexpected, the increase in oil stores was predicted to be a certain amount. The actual increase was much higher. And so supply of oil increases from S1 to S2, which usually would make the price lower. And we can see where S2 intersects demand 1, that it should make the price lower. However, at the same time, Trump and Iran, the US and Iran were currently in negotiations for the and people were very scared that there was going to be a war. And so they were expecting that the prices were going to be higher in the future. And so demand increased in the present because relatively the prices are lower. And because of this increase in demand from D1 to D2, we see that the price remains the same. And now I'm going to hand it off to my other wonderful group members. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to be going over foreign governments and oil supply and how it works and the effects over it. The example we're going to be using today is the Ecuadorian government and how they increased prices and made it more expensive for Colombian companies to transport their oil due to them charging more money to use their pipelines. This caused the supply curve to shift to the left, and this also causes the equilibrium price to increase and quantity to decrease. That's just because when price increases, the quantity of people, in particular, Colombian companies like transporting oil and selling oil, it causes that to go down. So basically, it's higher prices equals less quantity. When you increase production costs for companies, they're gonna produce less oil just because it's that much more expensive and they're not gonna be able to sell as much. We see this all the time when oil prices go up. Usually quantity decreases, usually. And on the curve, it's showed by S1 going to S2, that is the supply curve, and then you see PE1 to PE2, that is the price showing it increasing, and then you see quantity decreasing in QE1 to QE2.
So for slide 6, this graph initially shows the regular like supply and demand. But since there were reports that Iran might be using the Strait of Hormuz to increase the risk of like and cost of the transporting oil through that strait, suppliers reduced the amount of oil that they were able to bring to the market since they could no longer use that Strait of Hormuz safely. So this caused the supply curve to shift to the left from S1 to S2, indicating that there was a decrease in supply. So the new equilibrium actually occurs at a higher price, which is P2, and a lower quantity, Q2. Next, for slide 7, the graph initially shows that the market is in equilibrium with like price P1, quantity Q1, and supply like intersects demand normally. In this case, oil companies were becoming more aggressive and confident in their production, so they were willing to supply more oil at every price level, so the overall supply increases. So this is a rightward shift of the supply curve from S1 to S2. And so when the supply increases, new equilibrium occurs where S2 intersects with the demand curve. So at this new point, the equilibrium price decreases from P1 to P2, and where the equilibrium quantity also increases from Q1 to Q2. So yeah, there was an overall increase in supply that led to lower prices and higher quantity in the market.
For this slide, I will be going over the US government and their effect they had on the global supply of oil. So in the graph, we can see the supply curve shifts to the right. This is because the US government, when they took over Venezuela, they gained access to that big supply of crude oil and regular oil that Venezuela was sitting on. Because of this, the US gave out licenses to US companies to drill the oil and produce the oil to sell. So this significantly increased the quantity of oil readily available in the markets and for people to buy. This ultimately drove down price. And this works because when you increase price, when you increase quantity, you decrease price. Opposite to what I last talked about was when you increase the price, usually how much you can sell and the quantity decreases. This is the opposite. When you increase quantity, increase the amount of things available in the market, it's like supply and demand, price comes down because there's just more of it. So price gotta come down. We can see this when Q1 goes to Q2, that's the increase in quantity, and P1 to P2, that is the decrease in price. This affects the equilibriums, shifting the graph in the supply curve to the right.
All right. So hey guys, so now we're gonna move on to slides 9 and 10. So to start off with slide 9, as we can see, the first scenario we're looking at when it comes to the global demand for oil, we're gonna be looking at the Cuban market for oil. So here's the situation, just to play it out. The US issued a blockade, meaning the supply of oil in Cuba is already way less than demand. So there's a shortage. What does a shortage mean? So a shortage is going to mean that Cubans are going to be shifting towards electrical energy, things like solar power, oil fueled electricity, just other alternatives. What is that going to do to the demand curve, you might ask? Well, since tastes and preferences are just moving away from oil and towards electric energy, demands for oil decrease. So the demand curve is going to shift to the left from D1 to D2, as we can see in the picture. Now, here's the interesting part. You might think, does this fix the shortage? But honestly, not really. The price of oil does fall, but the shortage isn't eliminated. Remember, when quantity supplied hasn't changed, supply just stays the same. So while demand will drop and has dropped and the price can come down, we still have this gap between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded, meaning that a shortage might shrink, but it will always persist. And now, moving on to excuse me guys. So moving on to the global demand, but in the European market, what we can see here is the World Cup and how it's coming to the United States. And this is cool because it means that European airlines are expecting a big surge in travelers from Europe. What does more flights mean though? More flights means more oil, more fuel. So the mechanism here is going to be a twofold, meaning we're going to be anticipating a future event and the expectation that the oil prices are going to rise because of the increase in demand. Because airlines expect that they'll need significantly more fuel, more demand for oil, the demand curve is going to shift to the right from D1 to D2. When the demand increases with supply unchanged, we get a new equilibrium. Now, both the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity go up. So the European price of oil increases and more oil is brought and sold to the next market. Thank you, and we're going to keep going.
Hello, my name is Brandon Mose, and I'll be covering figures 9 and 10, as well as the reference slides for the group project. Starting off with figure 9, labeled the US market for oil, we see that the x-axis labeled for quantity and the y-axis is labeled for price. The Environmental Protection Agency, also known as EPA, is trying to lift many climate change regulations, which will make it easier for companies to obtain oil while also making it cost less. Due to this, we can see that the supply curve now will shift to the right, with the new supply curve being labeled S2. We see that the equilibrium quantity for oil will increase while the equilibrium price for oil will decrease. Moving on to figure 10, now labeled the California oil market, we still see the x-axis labeled for quantity and the y-axis is still labeled for price. Due to countries in Eastern Asia no longer transporting as much oil due to the ongoing US-Iran war, the supply for oil in California will decrease while the price will increase. We will see that the supply curve will shift to the left, with the new supply curve being labeled S2, and we see that the equilibrium quantity for oil will decrease while the equilibrium price for oil will increase. Here are the reference slides so you can see how we got all of our information. And that wraps up the group project.